Great to be with you again for another week of daily devotionals as part of our Growing Disciples course. In the month of March, our program takes us with the people of Israel into their promised land, following Israel's transition from theocracy to monarchy. Under Moses, Israel was a theocracy where God governed his people directly. He spoke and the people were to obey. God's speaking to Israel was often mediated through Moses or through the priesthood, the laws and the tabernacle system. But as Israel moves into their promised land under Joshua, we're introduced to the idea of Israel having a monarchy, where God would appoint a king. You might remember that toward the end of the book of Judges, we see the comment, "In those days Israel had no king." We see that at the beginning of chapters 18 and 19, and then in the final verse of the book, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." The phrase, "in those days," suggests a perspective looking back from a later time when Israel did indeed have a king. And so what happens next in this book of 1 Samuel is that we see this transition from a theocracy to a monarchy in Israel. And the narrative of 1 Samuel begins with the account of Hannah, a godly woman who prays earnestly for a child. Although loved by her husband Elkanah, Hannah is taunted by his other wife because she's not born children, even as they went up to the house of the Lord at Shiloh to worship. Chapter 1 verse 9, once when they'd finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." So we soon develop a picture of Eli the priest as nice, but ineffectual. Israel's spiritual leader here seems a nice enough old bloke, but he lacks the spiritual insight to understand that Hannah is earnestly praying and not drunk. He doesn't realize that she is a deeply godly woman whose answered prayer will change his life and the life of the nation of Israel. Well, Hannah's prayers are answered, and a son, Samuel, is born to her. She fulfills her vow to God, and when the time is right, young Samuel enters a life of service at the tabernacle under the care of old Eli the priest. But all is not well at the heart of Israel's life of worship at Shiloh. In 1 Samuel 2, we read about Eli's sons, who, as descendants of Aaron, have inherited the priesthood. Verse 12, Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. So remember that the priests lived off the sacrifices brought by the people. God gifted them a designated portion. And during the process of sacrifice, a certain piece was set aside for the priest to eat later. But it seems that Eli's sons wanted only the best bits that were actually reserved for the sacrifice itself. We might say that they belonged to God. And so we read in 1 Samuel 2:16, If the worshipper said to the priest, "Let the fat be burned first and then take whatever you want," the servant, that is the priest's servant, would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." The sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. So notice there in the text this juxtaposition of Eli's sons and Samuel. He's a boy wearing a priestly garment that his mum made him. He's earnest, innocent and pure. He's dressed up as kind of a boy bishop. And especially notice the contrast where he is set against the corrupt sons of Eli who are treating the Lord's offering with contempt. Well, what did Eli do about his sons? Well, he knew what was going on and he even told his sons, "You've got to stop this." But his sons ignored him. And all the while, that juxtaposition, Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favour with the Lord and all the people. So there is a crisis looming for Israel, a crisis of spiritual leadership. Eli is old, he's ineffectual and he's unable to rein in his sons. It won't be long before he dies, one would imagine. And godly worshippers in Israel, like Hannah and Elkanah and their family, they're going to be preyed upon by Eli's sons. But then, late in 1 Samuel 2, a prophet visits Eli and foretells actually, the judgment that will fall on Eli's sons and then upon Eli himself. They will all die in a single day. And once again, right alongside the tragedy of Eli's sons, we read again about the rise of Samuel. So in chapter 3, verse 19, the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, that is from north to south, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. And Samuel's word came to all Israel. So, at the conclusion of this first narrative unit in Samuel, we observe the tragic end of Eli, the priest, the old priest, and his line, who actually end up being replaced by Samuel. Samuel is a godly man, a prophet, and universally respected. And we pause then, right now, noting that this book that we're reading, a book that will introduce some of the greats of Israel's history, this book actually bears Samuel's name. It's not the book of Saul, it's not the book of David, it's named for Samuel. Why might that be, do you think? Well, in a crisis of leadership, beginning with Israel's spiritual leadership, we see God is sovereign in his appointment of leaders. And the arrogant, the fraudulent, the scoundrels, they do not ultimately mock God. Instead, he ensures their downfall and that justice is done. Whether in a short time or a long time, God's justice is certain. And this theme repeats in the books of Samuel over and again. At the same time, we see here that God can and does raise up his own leaders, a people of character and of heart, the people of his choosing. And so Samuel, born of an obscure family, rises to become the widely respected man of God at the helm of Israel's theocracy. Now, as Christian people in our context, we also become very conscious of the impact of our spiritual leaders, whether it be the leader of our parish church or the highly regarded preacher or just our Bible study group leader. And so we should pray for them often. And when there's a change of leadership, we must be especially prayerful and discerning. No matter whether we are voting at our annual general meeting for our new parish council, or whether we are at the election of the next archbishop, or whether we are voting in a state election. God's people have a duty to pray for those whom God has placed in positions of great responsibility. And so, as we begin this book of 1 Samuel, can I suggest that you pray now for those whose spiritual leadership impacts your walk with God?